At the edge of the wild river, a cowboy pulled her from death's grasp, but what she whispered in the firelight bound their fates forever. The river ran heavy with the thaw, swollen from mountain snow that had surrendered its hold to spring. Its voice was rough, carrying foam and splinters of driftwood, a voice that had carved canyons and swallowed men without pause. Elias rode alongside it at dusk, his bay gelding stepping careful on the rocky bank. The horizon stretched wide, endless, a canvas of dying fire where the sun had gone down bleeding into purple. Dust clung to his boots, the scent of wet earth rising sharp with the evening chill. It was then that he saw the flicker, a scrap of color caught against the gray stone. At first he thought it no more than a rag of cloth, lost from some wagon years before, but the fabric moved trembling and his eye sharpened. It was not cloth alone but a woman, her shawl tangled on the rocks, her arms thrashing against the pull of the current. Without thought, Elias swung down from his horse. The gelding startled at his sudden motion, reins loose, but Elias was already running, boots slipping on the slick bank. The river bit him cold as steel the moment he plunged in, stealing his breath and clawing at his chest. He forced his arms through the water, every stroke a fight until his hand seized hers. Her skin was ice. She gasped once when he pulled her free, no words, only the desperate sound of air returning. They stumbled together onto the mud, heaving, her shawl plastered to her body like a second skin. Elias dragged her farther from the edge where the river could no longer reach. Night had gathered by the time he built a fire from the driftwood and dry brush. Sparks climbed into the dark, carried away by wind. She sat close, shoulders hunched, clutching the embroidered shawl though it was wet and heavy. Her braid had come undone in the water, strands plastered against her cheek. The firelight caught on her face, hollow with exhaustion, yet bearing a beauty that came not from youth but from something etched deeper, like light through old glass. He set his coat across her shoulders, rough wool that smelled of horse and tobacco. "You'll need this," he said, voice low. She looked up then, eyes large in the firelight, a color he could not name, gray or blue or something between. For a long while she did not speak. The river thundered nearby, a constant reminder of what had almost claimed her. Elias sat opposite, warming his hands over the flames, not prying. A woman half drowned would speak when she chose, if she chose at all. But at last she whispered. The words trembled, yet they were steady enough to cut into him. "I will be the mother of your child." Elias blinked, sure he had misheard. The fire popped, throwing sparks, and she stared into it as if into judgment itself. Her voice carried no flirtation, no coyness, only a weight like a stone laid in the hand. It was not romance she spoke, nor seduction. It was desperation, a vow flung into the night as if her life depended on it. He did not answer. His eyes drifted to the shawl she clutched, embroidered with fading flowers. Threads frayed where the current had torn at it. The garment was a poor shield against the cold, yet she held it as though it were armor, as though it were all that bound her to herself. Silence thickened, broken only by the hiss of sap in the fire. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, long and mournful. Elias studied the woman. Clara, she had told him in a voice nearly drowned by the river. Clara, wife to a rancher whose name she did not give. The firelight carved shadows across her face, and Elias felt the weight of her words sink deep, heavier than any river could bear. He had pulled more than a body from the current tonight. He had drawn a secret, a wound, a story that clung to him as surely as her shawl clung to her. The wind shifted, carrying the damp smell of pine and earth. Elias leaned back, letting the night press against him. He knew nothing of her beyond her name and her vow, yet something in his bones whispered that his life would no longer be his own. She sat opposite him, shawl gathered, eyes on the fire, and the river sang on in the dark, an endless hymn of things carried away and of things returned. Dawn rose pale across the valley, washing the hills in cold silver. Mist clung low over the grasslands, and the air smelled of frost and smoke, as though the night had not yet loosened its grip. Elias rode slow, the reins slack in his hand, Clara seated behind him on the gelding's back. Her shawl had dried stiff in the night, its embroidery dulled by river water stains. She leaned silent, her breath shallow, every jolt of the horse pulling a wince from her, though she tried to hide it. The road bent toward a spread of land that might once have been proud. The ranch came into view, a weathered house, its paint long gone to gray, its porch sagging. Fences leaned like old men weary of standing. In the yard lay tools scattered as if abandoned mid-task, bridles cracked with neglect, plows red with rust, a hatchet sunk into a stump long forgotten. The whole place carried the air of labor left unfinished, of care withdrawn. On the porch stood a man, Jedediah. His frame was broad but bent with years, his beard gone to ash and his eyes sharp as flint beneath heavy brows. A rifle rested easy against the porch rail, its barrel catching the first touch of light. As Elias drew the horse to a halt, Jedediah's mouth twisted into something like a smile, though it bore no warmth. "You've brought her back," he said. His voice carried gravel, the scrape of stone on stone. Clara slid carefully from the saddle. She kept her gaze down, the braid that had come loose last night now retied with trembling hands. A bruise marred her cheekbone dark against her pale skin. Elias noticed it as surely as the rifle, and in that instant the river's mystery sharpened into certainty. She had not slipped. The river had been an escape. Jedediah stepped forward, his boots heavy on the porch boards. He placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, not gently. "My wife has a way of wandering," he said. "Fortunate that a man like you happened by." Elias kept his face still, his voice steady. The current was strong. Another hour and she'd not have seen dawn. Jedediah's grip tightened. Clara flinched but did not speak. The older man gave a short laugh, though it carried no mirth. "She's always been delicate. Can't say she takes to this land as well as some." His hand dropped, but the rifle stayed near as though it were part of him. The silence stretched. Clara's eyes lifted once, only once, to meet Elias's. In that glance was more than fear. There was a plea, raw and unspoken, as though her very soul leaned toward him though her body remained bound to the porch. Then her gaze fell again, swallowed into obedience. Jedediah broke the stillness with words polished thin like coins rubbed too long. "I thank you, stranger, for your trouble. But she's home now." The pause after the word home seemed deliberate, waited, daring Elias to question it. Elias inclined his head. "A man doesn't ride past a drowning woman." Jedediah's mouth curved again into that semblance of a smile. "A man doesn't know, but he also knows when to ride on." His eyes flicked to the gelding, then back. The message was clear. Whatever had happened in the river was to remain between them. Elias swung into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. Clara stood small beneath the porch shadow, shawl clutched tight, her face turned away. He wanted to speak, to promise, to swear something into the cold air. But the rifle gleamed beside Jedediah, and the silence between them all felt like powder waiting on a spark. He gave the horse a nudge and turned down the track. As he rode, his eyes lingered on the ranch, the tools left to rot, the fences broken, the house sagging beneath neglect. It was not only Clara who bore wounds. The land itself seemed starved, hollowed, as if reflecting the man who held it in his grasp. The mist began to lift as Elias put distance between himself and the house. The river's roar had faded, but its memory lingered. He carried with him the weight of Clara's gaze, the bruise on her cheek, the unspoken plea lodged between her silence and Jedediah's cruel steadiness. He knew with a certainty as sharp as the morning air that he had seen too much to walk away untouched. The valley stretched wide before him, but the freedom of the horizon no longer felt like freedom. Behind him on that broken ranch, a woman's life hung suspended, caught between silence and survival, and Elias understood, though he did not yet admit it aloud, that his path had already begun to bend toward hers. The town lay under a sky of iron, clouds heavy and low. Elias rode in from the north trail, his horse weary, its flanks darkened with sweat. The street stretched long between false front buildings, their windows dim, lanterns unlit in the daylight gloom. A wind had come with the storm, carrying grit and the tang of rain. He tied his gelding outside the saloon just as the first drops began to fall, fat and cold, scattering circles in the dust. By the time his boots hit the boardwalk, voices cut through the hush of rain. Harsh, rising, edged with fury. He turned his head and saw them, Clara and Jedediah, halfway down the street. The rancher's voice boomed, coarse and bitter, echoing against the wooden fronts. Clara stood small before him, shawl clutched against her breast, her braid neat but trembling loose at its ends. Then the blow came. Jedediah's hand struck hard across her face, a sound that cracked even through the patter of rain. She staggered, stumbled, and fell into the mud of the street, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her braid unraveling until strands lay plastered against her cheek. Elias moved before he thought. The distance between them closed in long strides, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. When his voice came, it cut sharper than thunder. "Not as long as I live." The words silenced the street. Doors cracked open, boots scuffed along porches. Men and women leaned from the shadows of thresholds drawn by the sound of defiance. The storm thickened overhead, rain falling harder, turning dust to sludge. Jedediah turned, his glare lit with fury, spittle shining on his beard. His hand twitched toward the rifle slung across his back. But he did not draw. Something in Elias's stance and the calm steadiness of his eyes stilled him. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. "Keep out of what ain't yours," Jedediah growled, his words half a snarl, half a warning. Elias did not move, did not falter. A man who strikes a woman in the street forfeits his right to call her his. The murmur of the crowd was soft but present, like wind stirring dry grass. Jedediah's face darkened, his shoulders squared. Yet he seemed smaller somehow, diminished under the weight of many watching eyes. For all his bluster, he found no strength to raise his rifle. Clara pushed herself up from the mud. Her dress clung sodden to her frame, her shawl stained and heavy. A thin red line marked her temple where his blow had broken skin, the scar of a wound that would not vanish soon. She did not speak, did not weep. Her eyes, steady and clear now, fixed on Elias. In them, Elias saw not gratitude but defiance, a quiet fire long smothered, now breathing again. She gave him no thanks, no smile. Only that gaze, strong and unyielding, as though she had chosen to stand beside him in silence, though the whole world pressed against her. Jedediah spat into the mud, curses rough on his tongue. Yet when he stepped back, when his boots sank into the muck of retreat, the crowd knew what had shifted. He had been challenged in the open, and for the first time he had yielded. The rain fell harder, running down Elias's face, dripping from the brim of his hat. He kept his hand near the revolver, though he did not draw. Clara stood, gathering her shawl, shoulders squared though her body trembled. Together they stood in the storm, the air alive with tension, the scent of powder though no shot had been fired. Elias understood then that the path before him had changed. In one moment, spoken beneath the weight of rain and eyes, he had bound his fate to hers. The line had been crossed. There was no riding back to solitude, no retreat to silence. He had taken her burden into himself and all the danger it carried. Clara turned, lifting her chin despite the mud and the bruise, and walked back toward the porch of the general store. She did not look at Jedediah. She did not look at anyone. But Elias watched and the town watched, as she carried herself with a dignity that no blow could erase. The storm broke fully then, rain drumming rooftops, washing the blood from her temple, the mud from her dress. Elias stood rooted in the street, the revolver heavy at his side, knowing the reckoning had only just begun. Winter swept in like a slow tide, steady and unrelenting. Snow came first in flurries, soft and harmless, then heavier until the valley lay hidden beneath a white shroud. Roads disappeared, fences vanished beneath drifts, and even the river grew hushed, its roar muted under a skin of ice. The world turned pale, every sound muffled, as though the land itself had been wrapped in silence. In his cabin at the edge of the pines, Elias endured the long nights. The hearth burned steady, its smoke climbing into the rafters, yet the warmth seemed thin against the endless cold outside. He sat often in his rocking chair, its creak the only rhythm in the room. Across his knees lay his rifle, the steel gleaming as he worked it slow with oiled cloth. The ritual kept his hands busy, but his mind was never far from Clara. He saw her in the firelight, shawl clutched close, braid loose against her cheek, eyes that held both plea and defiance. He remembered her words whispered by the river's edge, "I will be the mother of your child." They came back to him like smoke in the rafters, impossible to banish, curling through every thought until he could not tell whether they were memory or dream. While he sharpened steel, she endured bitterness. At the ranch, Jedediah's temper grew sharp as the frost. Clara learned to move quiet, to leave no mark that might provoke him. Yet in the small hours, when he snored heavy in the adjoining room, she took to writing letters. Words poured onto scraps of paper, pleas, confessions, fragments of a life she longed to live. At dawn, she fed them to the stove, watching the flames devour every line. The ashes carried out the chimney, scattering across the snowfields like ghosts. Her hands sought work to hold the silence. She sewed by lamplight, the needle flashing through cloth. Among her hidden things lay a dress, white, unfinished, its seams pinned but never stitched. Once it had been meant for a wedding day, for joy and promise. Now it sat folded in shadow, each stitch she added trembling with sorrow. The fabric became a symbol not of celebration but of theft, a future promised and withheld. Snow piled against the windows, drifts bearing the threshold. Elias dreamed in the hush of storm. He imagined Clara's voice in the snow, imagined laughter he had never heard, imagined braids undone not by grief but by joy. He built a life in his thoughts, fragile as frost on the window pane, vanishing each morning when the fire died low. The days stretched long and colorless. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys across the valley, proof of other lives waiting out the season. Yet Elias felt only the hollow ache of distance. He did not ride to the ranch. The storm made such journeys near impossible, and danger lay too heavy there. Still his thoughts rode the trail every night, carrying him to her whether he willed it or not. Clara, too, lived bound by silence. She traced the grain of the wooden table, the rough edge of old tools in the barn, the worn threads of her shawl. Each detail became an anchor to endure. She folded the dress again and again, pressing it smooth as though order could be wrestled from sorrow. Winter pressed on, week into week, the snow deepening, the air biting sharp as knives. Yet beneath the stillness, both Clara and Elias felt the same truth take root. Though the world kept them apart, though silence weighed heavier than words, they were already bound. No vow spoken aloud could make it clearer. It was written instead in glances, in bruises remembered, in firelit dreams. The rocking chair creaked, the needle flashed, and the season of waiting stretched without end. Each breath of frost was a reminder that love sometimes came not as thunder, but as endurance, quiet and unseen, waiting for the thaw. Spring came slow to the valley, creeping in with meltwater and soft rains. Snow withdrew from the ridges first, then from the meadows, leaving behind mud and swollen streams. The air smelled of thawing earth, sharp and raw. Yet with the return of color came also unrest. Elias felt it in his bones, the way a man feels the river rise before flood. Trouble gathered, silent but sure. Word of the street confrontation lingered long after the storm had passed. Jedediah's pride was not one to forgive. Clara's bruises became more frequent, her silences deeper. The few who passed through town noticed the shadows under her eyes, but none spoke. A rancher with a rifle and a temper was a wall few dared climb. One night the knock came. Elias had been sitting by the fire, chair creaking as he drew the whetstone across his knife. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the scent of rain on its breath. The knock was soft, almost lost in the storm, but it carried the weight of desperation. He opened the door and found Clara. Her shawl was torn, streaked with mud. Her lip was split, one eye bruised deep purple. She held herself as if she might shatter, yet her voice was steady. "I cannot go back," Elias said nothing. He stepped aside and she entered, the firelight bathing her in warmth. She sank onto the chair nearest the hearth, clutching the shawl as though it still might shield her. For the first time since the river, she seemed emptied of fear, not because it had left her, but because she had borne it too long. Not long after, another sound rose, the crunch of boots on wet earth, the groan of the porch boards. Elias knew before the knock came again. Jedediah. The door trembled under his fist. "Send her out," he bellowed, voice thick with rage. "She is mine." Elias stood in the doorway, rifle laid across his arms. The moonlight caught on the steel, a quiet gleam against the dark. Behind him, Clara sat rigid, her shawl pulled close. The night became still save for the wind. Two men faced each other, one hollowed by rage, the other steady as stone. Jedediah's hand gripped his rifle, knuckles pale. His face twisted with fury, eyes burning with something beyond reason. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You'll not steal what belongs to me." Elias's voice came low even. "A woman is not a thing to be stolen. She chooses her place." The word struck harder than any bullet. Jedediah staggered under them, not in body but in spirit. Years of bitterness coiled inside him, and in that moonlit moment it seemed to eat him alive. His rifle trembled, raised an inch, then fell again. His curses filled the night, bitter and broken, yet no shot came. At last he stepped back. The porch groaned under his retreat. He hurled his fury into the dark, but his boots carried him away, swallowed by wind and distance. The silence that followed was heavy, vast as the valley itself. Inside, Clara wept. Not loud, not for the man who had left, but for the years carved from her life, the years lost to fear. Her tears fell into her shawl, staining it darker than river water ever had. Elias set the rifle aside. He did not touch her, not yet. He only sat across from her, firelight flickering between them, both of them breathing the same heavy silence. He knew then what love meant, not a flame leaping quick, but endurance, survival, the choice to stand against storm and shadow. The wind howled against the cabin, but inside something shifted. Not peace, not yet, but release. Time softened, though it did not erase. Days gathered into weeks, weeks into months. The valley shifted with the seasons, green pressing through the earth where snow had once ruled. Rivers that once threatened with flood now carried life through the meadows, their voices calmer like hymns sung low. In the cabin by the pines, Elias and Clara began to piece a life together. Though both bore scars the world could not see, their days were quiet, marked not by grand events but by the rhythm of simple labors. Elias rose early to tend the horse, his boots sinking into the thawed earth. Clara brewed coffee on the stove, its sharp scent rising with dawn, mingling with the cool air drifting through the open door. She often sat in the rocking chair by the window, shawl draped across her shoulders. The chair creaked steady, a lull of wood on wood as she embroidered with patient fingers. The cloth beneath her needle bore no grand design, only flowers, small and sturdy, stitched in muted colors. She said little as she worked, yet her silence was no longer the silence of fear. It was the stillness of a woman reclaiming her own breath. Elias watched her sometimes, more often than he admitted. He saw the way light fell across her face, softening lines carved by hardship. He saw her hands tremble less each day, and in those small signs he found a strength greater than any storm. One morning in spring, when the fields outside began to bloom and the air smelled of fresh grass and wet soil, Clara set her needle aside. She looked toward Elias, who stood at the stove pouring coffee, and her voice carried through the quiet. "I will be the mother of your child." The words fell familiar on his ear, yet they no longer struck like a wound. This time they held no desperation, no vow flung into darkness. They were steady, filled with a strength earned through fire and snow, through nights of fear and mornings of endurance. Elias did not speak. Instead, he crossed the room and took her hand, rough palm closing around hers. Their silence spoke enough, the silence of understanding, of promise without flourish. Outside, the yard bore its own testimony. The old tools that once lay broken now hung mended on their pegs, steel polished, wood handles smoothed by care. The axe gleamed, the plow stood ready, the bridles oiled and strong. What had once been symbols of decay now marked renewal, proof that what was neglected could still be restored. Through the open door drifted the sound of the river. It no longer roared with menace but flowed gentle, feeding the earth, carrying away the past without drowning the present. Life moved forward, scarred yet enduring. Clara leaned into the rocking chair, her hand still clasped in Elias's, her shawl falling soft across her shoulders. The chair creaked, steady as a heartbeat. In the fire's glow, in the dawn light, they sat together, not healed entirely but alive, and that was enough. The valley bloomed. The snow had melted. The story that began with water and fire ended with earth and seed. And in the quiet of that cabin, in the silence between two hands joined, the child of tomorrow already stirred.